I wanted to come into this review and tell you that the negativity around Avowed is overblown and that people are hating on it just for clout. But the sad truth is, a lot of those criticisms aren't exaggerations. There is a great game hidden somewhere in Avowed, and whether it needed more time to cook in the oven or that Obsidian thought that this was a good enough product is a question that we may never really get the answer to. It's heavily rumored that Obsidian is already working on their next title, The Outer Worlds 2, and it may be arriving late in 2025. If that's the case, it may explain some of the shortcomings we received in Avowed. We'll go over story, setting, gameplay, and more to see if Obsidian's latest RPG lives up to its full potential. I have a lot of thoughts about Avowed, so let's hop into the review. Let's begin with the story of Avowed, which unfortunately is something that I was disappointed with. In this game, you are a godlike, a person that has been touched by the gods, which explains why you look like a clicker from The Last of Us. Actually, it doesn't really explain why at all. Without going into much spoilers, you find yourself speaking with a bootleg version of the Emperor from Baldur's Gate 3, and this thing, well, it sucks. It's always talking in code like it doesn't want you to know what's actually going on in the story. It's one of the most frustrating parts about the story, in my opinion. You unfortunately never grow close to this god thing, and to be entirely honest, I don't think any of the dialogue choices you make with it matter at all to the story. At least not from what I noticed. You could be arguing with this thing one day, and the next time you talk to it, it's talking to you like you weren't just an asshole to it last night. It's very strange. I would go as far as saying that most of the dialogue choices you make in this game don't matter for the overarching story. Sometimes you will be able to squeal out of a fight by picking the correct dialogue choices, but for the most part, when it comes to your companions, it doesn't matter. You can spam literally whatever you want during the conversation with them, and they will talk to you completely normal the next day. Now, the companions honestly are decent. They are nowhere close to what Mass Effect or Baldur's Gate companions have offered in the past, but they will suffice. Kai is obviously the best one. He's the best written and the most likable, but it sucks that they made his character you know, super touchy subject. I'd rather just leave it at that. Most of the side characters you meet are bland and boring as well, and don't really help with making the world feel believable or lived in, especially because so many of them share the same damn face. They do make an attempt at world building, but for me, it fell flat much of the time. I understand that Avowed is a continuation of the Pillars of Eternity series, and much of the lore comes from those games, which personally I am not a big fan of. As someone who has never played those games and sadly doesn't have the time to, I just feel like I'm missing out on a large portion of the story or plot. Like, I would probably be enjoying this much more if I knew what they were talking about already. But on the other hand, I have to imagine there are players who find themselves annoyed because these characters insist on telling them something they already know, since NPCs are not sure if you have played the previous games. You see how it's such a weird choice to have Avowed be a continuation of the Pillars games? I think I would have enjoyed them making an entirely new world with new lore for Avowed. Obviously, that's a lot to ask for, but I think it would have been great for the game and better off for the story. My overall feelings on the story and characters are mixed, to say the least. You hear a lot of people say, well, not every game needs to be Baldur's Gate 3, but I hate that sentiment sometimes. Because honestly, games should thrive for that. Games should shoot for the moon. When you go from Baldur's Gate 3 to Avowed, you can feel the difference that the characters and the story bring to the game. In a previous video, I mentioned that Baldur's Gate 3 had over 1,000 hours of voice acting recorded, and sadly, it's very apparent that Avowed has no such feat. Games should shoot for the highest quality possible, especially if you're charging people the same price as those aforementioned games. Let's move on to the gameplay. I have a love-hate relationship with the overworld of Avowed. In one hand, I'm so happy that it isn't an actual open world. The map is smaller and overall more dense and packed, which is a good thing because overall I'm getting really tired of open world games. But it has almost nothing interesting in it. Sure, it's littered with some combat here and there and some side characters that are usually tied to side missions, but for the most part, it's not that entertaining. One of the biggest issues with the overworld is how it distributes items to you. You find the coolest items just hidden in some random areas of the map. They are not tied to story quests or side quests whatsoever. And again, I'm torn. I'm glad that the game rewards me for exploring, but the cost of this is getting no interesting rewards from side quests. And don't get it twisted. The items that you use in this game matter a lot. This is a game where the rarity of your item can determine how difficult the game will be for you. If your items are not progressing to higher tiers as you progress the story, you will struggle. So it is in your best interest to explore the map as much as possible before continuing the story, since not only will you find better items, but you will find much of the upgrade materials that you need for said items. This is Avowed's gameplay loop. It wants you to step into town as little as possible, because they are god awful, and spend most of your time out in the overworld exploring and doing quests, which is honestly so much better than the towns. I'm sure you have heard it plenty now that Avowed's combat is probably the best thing it has going for it. It's fun, it feels punchy, your attacks feel great, and magic is super fun to use. I mentioned before that if Skyrim had this combat, I think it would be my favorite game of all time. Combat is fun, especially when you finally understand what the game is asking you to do. Let me explain. As mentioned before, Avowed wants you to explore and pick up as many rare items as you can and upgrade them as you go. This may be uncommon advice, but I suggest that you respec whenever you get a new item that you want to use. Avowed is very greedy with its perk distribution. Growing levels can feel grindy, and honestly, I don't think the game gives you enough, which is probably why respecking is so cheap to do. I found the best way to progress without ever getting stuck in an area was to play with the highest rarity item that you own or that you can upgrade to. For instance, I started the game as a mage/sword wielder, but soon after entering the second zone, I found myself literally getting combo womboed by these goddamn things. But soon after, I found a greatsword that was purple rarity and caused bleed damage. So I respec my character to be able to utilize this greatsword, and I began to breeze through the area. Hey, I know you could play however you want. I don't have an issue with that. This is just how I found playing enjoyable. It was fun switching up my build every few hours too, since Avowed really doesn't let you be more than one class, since the levels you gain are so far and few between. And speaking of levels, some of the perks are cool, but many of them just don't do enough. Like this one. Gain health when you break stuff? Seriously, there isn't even that much stuff to break. Much of the environment is not even interactable. And since we're talking about things that we can't interact with, let's talk about the graphics and performance. Overall, for me, performance was good. I have a 4080 Super and a pretty decent PC. I ran Avowed on ultra settings, hitting above 60 frames per second throughout my playthrough. I watched Luke Steffen's video about the game being completely broken for him, but personally, I never had any of those issues. Maybe it's because he had a pre-patch version, but I'm not really sure. I can assure you though that in my 30 hours of gameplay, I ran into very few bugs, for the most part, because there are some technical hiccups here and there, but honestly, nothing crazy enough to truly get in the way of your experience. Now let's talk about the big elephant in the room, the art style. When Avowed was announced, we got a dark and gritty trailer, one that gave us Shadow of the Mordor or Skyrim vibes. But after years of no updates, the gameplay was finally revealed, and then we got this. And I get it, it's not everyone's cup of tea, and to be honest, it's not really mine either. It's a strange mix of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, and Baldur's Gate. It's not in any way the most hideous game I've ever played. Far from it, actually. Some of the set pieces can be really beautiful and epic. Like this fossil I found on the side of the cliff. I think it looks great, and I was surprised when I found it. Sadly, I never found out what it was, what its backstory was, or why it was even here. Trust me, you don't see anything like this in the overworld. It's like they were trying to give you the thrill that you got when you found the gargantuan fossil in Subnautica, which was a great surprise in that game, but that fossil had a story. There were lore implications behind it, and even though it was a set piece like this, it had a purpose to be there. And this is an issue. You are Obsidian. You are one of the more seasoned developers. How are you getting outpaced by an indie dev? The same goes with the overworld basically ignoring your character. The grass doesn't care if you slash it, the animals and trees don't care if you interact with them, and shit, people don't even care if you stab them or shoot them with a fireball. Compare this to a game like Sons of the Forest where everything is interactable. The grass, the trees, the tents, people, and bodies. Seriously, almost everything you see in that game, you can interact with. Obsidian, you are a very talented dev team. And to see things like this get ignored, it makes me wonder where the dev time went. Was it all in the combat? Was it in the overworld? Because everything feels half-baked in a way. I guess now is a better time than ever to go into speculation on why I think this is. My guess is that Obsidian did not want to go all in on this game. Maybe because it was available on Game Pass. I'm not sure. Honestly, it feels like a cope answer, but this can't be the best they can do. Some of these Western devs need to realize that there's real competition out there now. And not only are indie devs making some of the best games out there, they aren't charging $70. And if we are paying a premium price, we should be expecting a Baldur's Gate, an Elden Ring, a GTA 6. Matter of fact, Elden Ring was $60. Like, what are we doing? Final verdict. Is Avowed worth it? Well, if you have Game Pass, there's really no reason not to give it a shot. It's far from a perfect game, but there's some fun to be had. If you can overlook the weak story and forgettable characters, you might still enjoy the combat. Slashing through enemies and hurling magic can be satisfying in short bursts. And in those moments, you might catch glimpses of the ambitious RPG Avowed was meant to be. But as a full price RPG experience, it falls short of Obsidian's best work, leaving more questions than excitement for what's next. Avowed gets 6 Jobins out of 10. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing. We'll be reviewing all the new games that I can buy because you know your boy ain't getting them for free. Let me know if there are any other games out there that you'd be interested in me reviewing. They can be old, recent, like in the last year or so. Don't matter. Just let me know. Thanks. Hugs and kisses.